Thank you. Come on. Good evening, everyone. My name is Denise Mankey. I'm the business manager with the Washington Native Plant Society. I'd like to welcome you tonight to tonight's program, our final presentation as a part of Native Plant Appreciation Month. Please feel free to tell us who you are and where you're from. We have a big group joining us tonight, we hope. Such a beautiful evening. It's wonderful to get such a great attendance of folks amongst friends. I see someone here in the room that I'd like to actually have join us, if you don't mind. Kathy Darrow, I see that you're here tonight and I'd like to allow you to talk. So you could tell me in the chat if that's okay. Tonight we are going to present a small award before we get started that all began with discovery that Kathy made. So I'd love to empower her to be a part of this with us. Kathy, are you okay with that? Great. So I've selected allow to talk. Oh, wrong person. Oh no, let's see. Kathy Glassman, I'm sorry, you popped in right next to Kathy Darrow. Kathy, welcome. You feel free to turn on your voice.
I'm here.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can talk about this wonderful story and what unfolded with the beautiful photos we selected for Native Plant Appreciation Month. And one was taken by Jane Abel. It's this photo here that you see of a bee feeding on Salvia dorii, or purple sage, so fondly admired in Eastern Washington. The bee is so beautiful and attractive and active that one doesn't naturally see a hidden creature. I did not see it. Photographer Jane Abel did not see it. And Kathy, why don't you tell us about the start of your discovery?
Well, I got these the postcards that we were given to spread the word about Native Plant Appreciation Month. And I saw this caterpillar that's really well camouflaged on the lower tier of the flowers. And it's a lavender caterpillar. And so I wrote to the office and said, hey, does anybody know what kind of caterpillar that is? Because I looked in all the books I have that might help, but I couldn't find anything. So now I'm curious, did you find the answer?
We do have the answer. And you suggested Robert Michael Pyle and several very popular butterfly people. Jane herself became extremely interested, and there was quite a conversation. And we have found the answer through David James, who is a professor at WSU. And so, but before we get to the direct answer, we decided that this was so fun, we would put it on our Just for Kids page on the website as sort of a science adventure for kids. And we shared several points of information. First of all, taxonomy information about purple sage and where it grows, and Then we progress to beautiful bees with information about Washington's native bees. And then finally, our hidden creature. And what's that bug? And we challenged kids to use their search wisdom to let us know what they thought it might be. And we had one response. So I wanted to review that response tonight, and I hope our young researcher is with us. And yes, this plant is gorgeous, and I've actually seen it on partner websites because we share our collateral for Native Plant Appreciation Month with our partners, hoping that they too will help educate Washington's public about the importance of native plants. So we had Amanda Bailey send in information suggesting that perhaps it was Xystopepilus rufago. That is not correct. The correct answer is Pyrasta orificalis, and I will show you that information, otherwise known as the orange mint moth. And for folks that are in Eastern Washington, you know there is quite a bit of mint agriculture in Eastern Washington, and this would be one of the host plants. So that's information comes to us thanks of Dr. David James. But Amanda is our winner as the only responder to this challenge on our website. And so Amanda will receive Washington Native Plant Society lanyard with a 10x hand lens. Thank you for taking the challenge, Amanda. So thanks for walking through that with us. It was fun for us here in the office. And I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the volunteers that make Washington Native Plant Society's Native Plant Appreciation Month happen. We meet all year long to make this event happen, and the committee is small but mighty. It is led by Chair Gail Sklar, who is also the Vice President of the Board of Directors. Thank you, Gail Sklar. Round of applause for your leadership. And Julie O'Donnell is one of our panel members, and Julie does a wonderful job providing all kinds of support, being suggestions for speakers, communications with chapters, and of course, feedback on all the resources that we build to make this event happen. We also have Cece Asplund from the Wenatchee Valley chapter. Thank you, Cece. And lastly, Van Bobbitt, who is our past president and steward chair coordinator. And Chair Van, thank you for your wisdom, particularly your help with understanding statewide programming and the nursery community and how we can partner with others around the state of Washington. I also just want to give a shout out to our chapter chairs and the folks that do outreach in chapters. The intent of this program is to get the word, our mission, our goals in protecting native plants and the beautiful habitats of Washington out into the public. And I am very pleased that in the, I think it's 17 years of operation now, Native Plant Appreciation Month has consistently attracted the goals of our governors here in the state of Washington with our governor's proclamation. So thank you all for joining us. And it's my pleasure to turn tonight's program over to Julie O'Donnell. Thank you for speaking up, Kathy. And Kathleen Glassman, and I will return both of you to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. And we're really not quite done with the committee acknowledgement yet, because Denise and Bridget in the main office are phenomenal. Their support and Denise's ideas and overview of Washington Native Plant Society as a statewide organization are just make all the difference. Not to mention all the technical support and the brilliant work with the Just for Kids page and the Native Plant Appreciation Month webpage. So tremendous amount of work. So thank you so much, Denise, and also Bridget. We're so glad that you make it all happen.
Very good. So with that, let's get on with the show. And thanks for joining us this evening.
Okay, I will go ahead and welcome and say good evening. And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Coast Salish people, the original and continuing stewards of the coastlines and forests of the Salish Sea. Thank you for joining us for this concluding program of Native Plant Appreciation Month, as we've explored topics about planting for tomorrow with native plants. This month, we've recognized partner organizations who share in our work to protect and restore native plant communities throughout the state of Washington. I hope you will continue to visit our website at WNPS.org, where you will find chapter activities that take place throughout Washington state. I now have the pleasure of introducing Clay Antio. Clay is a full-service plant science practitioner, offering unique abilities and perspectives in horticulture, botany, restoration, environmental education, and science communication. Clay has a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture from Purdue University, along with an MS and a PhD in Botany and Horticulture from the University of Washington. He's a fellow, past president, and past chapter chair of the Washington Native Plant Society, as well as a past president of the Northwest chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration. Now, please join me in welcoming Clay Antio.
Well, thank you, Julie, and greetings, people of Earth, and thank you for the standing ovation. That's a little bit of Zoom humor. I'm speaking to you tonight from the 45th floor of the Seattle Municipal Tower in the city of Seattle, home of the Kraken, the city, not the tower. And I have gorgeous views of Mount Baker and, as Harvey Manning used to call it, Nongapilchuk. Hard to compete with this kind of evening, but I appreciate all of you and your attention tonight. We'll be talking about a wide variety of different things. I do want to just first thank Julie and WNPS for this opportunity to participate in Native Plant Appreciation Month and to be able to share my thoughts on resilient gardening, a topic that I, as a gardener and restorationist, have been wrestling with for quite a while. Tonight, I'll be touching on a number of topics that I've touched on in a wide variety of venues, both for Native Plant Society as well as other organizations. Topics such as wood chips as soil amendment, why earthworms may not be such a good thing, native plants for adaptive and efficient landscapes, strategic importance of plant selection, that kind of stuff. And so I'll apologize in advance if any of those references seem obtuse, but feel welcome to ask me to elaborate tonight, or I'll reach out afterward and I'll provide more information. So I trust that in our audience tonight, we all realize that collectively, the decisions we make as individuals, as consumers, and as gardeners impact our communities, our regional ecosystems, and our planetary ecosystem and climate, for better or for worse. Fortunately, to encourage all of us to make positive lifestyle and consumer choices for the planet and biodiversity, There are abundant resources available that inspire and instruct us to be better stewards within our own spheres of influence. You're familiar with many of these, I'm sure. Aldo Leopold, among the first to start this dialogue in his Asand County Almanac, Rachel Carson in her A Silent Spring, Sarah Reichard, The Conscientious Gardener, Cultivating a Garden Ethic, and more lately, perhaps more popular in terms of exposure and presence, we have Dr. Doug Tallamy weighing in with his Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. Benjamin Voigt, the young angry practitioner, with his A New Garden Ethic, Cultivating Defiant Compassion for an Uncertain Future. There's Thomas Rainier and Claudia West with their Planting in a Post-Wild World, and Mary Reynolds, We Are the Ark, Returning Our Gardens to Their True Nature Through Acts of Restorative Kindness. Ark, Acts of Restorative Kindness, and so forth. Abundant resources out there. The authors of those works espouse principles and suggestions urging us to make smart ethical choices and to ungarden or rewild our garden spaces and private landscapes. And you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. Eschew lawns, avoid chemicals, ditch internal combustion engines, emphasize native plant species, think about other organisms and so forth. Good stuff, clearly. And in my opinion, often repetitive and commonsensical in nature, even becoming at times twee or banal. Perhaps it's just me and those of us steeped in or otherwise predisposed to be concerned about these things, but sometimes it gets a little cringeworthy. I recently ran across a promotion for a virtual presentation, and well, something like this, although I'm quoting: saving nature is easy, fun, and educational for the whole family, as well as a huge benefit to Mother Nature. Yipes. I'm sure Mother Nature really appreciates that. So relevant to our time together tonight, many of those earth-friendly principles and suggestions may or may not be helpful for gardens at the micro scale in highly urbanized, densified settings. For example, not everyone has the space to plant a large growing caterpillar supporting oak tree. Considering such things as the size of the parcel in which they garden, constraints imposed by underground and above ground utilities, locations of sidewalks and other right-of-way infrastructure, neighbor concerns, and so forth. And more often, these principles and suggestions often conveniently ignore what are, in my world, important existential considerations, including things we are never to speak about, which I'll speak about later tonight. My intent is to generally avoid repeating those easy principles and suggestions and attempt a higher plane of awareness or emphasis to capture, for me, the essences of resilience gardening, particularly in consideration of the scales and urban contexts in which many of us operate as gardeners. I'll attempt to provide some new or different insights that I hope you'll discover to be practical and realistic, provocative and inspiring as we dive into resilient gardens for uncertain futures. And I'll do this while attempting to avoid sounding like a grumpy old fart, which unfortunately I find increasingly difficult to do, but I will give it a good shot. So it might be best to first talk about what resilience is. And so I'm going to start sharing my presentation here. And we'll start out with perhaps one of the easiest to absorb definitions of resilience. You might be thinking that you've heard this term before. It's widely used in terms of climate adaptation. It's widely used in the restoration sciences. But the best and most useful definition of resilience that I found is in this slim book called Resilience Thinking. And highly recommended, by the way, due to its brevity, its accessibility, its excellent illustrative real life case studies. in this book, they use a definition that's listed here on my slide. It's the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. In different words, still retain essentially the same function. In different words, resilience is the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to a disturbance by resisting damage and recovering quickly. The authors are basically asking, how can landscapes and human communities absorb disturbance and maintain function? How can they respond to a disturbance by resisting damage and recovering quickly? And so while their scope in this text focuses on the mega and meso scales in terms of human communities and the regional ecosystems in which those communities exist, I find that the issues they raise effectively scale down to the micro scale, a scale at which I, and perhaps many of you, interact with in our urban ecosystems by way of our gardens and landscapes, one minuscule parcel at a time. For our purposes, we might alter the question to how can, well, let me just get my presentation going here, and then my animations should work. How can one garden and its gardener or gardeners absorb disturbance and maintain function that that garden offers? So at this point, the conversation gets a little more complex. So we might be talking about disturbances, and at regional scales, disturbances are generally best understood as things like wildfire, intensifying drought, hotter growing seasons, or sea level rise. Disturbances at the micro scale, though, might include similar disturbances such as intensifying drought and hotter growing seasons, but it could also include micro scale disturbances that can have important effects on the success and functioning of small scale gardens. Things like changes in insulation, the amount of shading caused by adjacent or resident trees or new construction next door, infestations of pests or diseases like wireworms, which came up in Andy Clay's and David's talk last Monday. Depletion of organic soil carbon, errant motor vehicles, and even vandalism from angry neighbors who don't like you. And sometimes disturbances at the microscale threaten obliteration from which there is no return. The hundreds of others who write and speak about resilience gardening often focus on growing food and managing for crisis, or both. So think along the lines of pandemic resilience gardening, climate resilience gardening, nuclear holocaust resilience gardening, and so forth. But resilience in my world goes beyond here and now, or the very brief lifetime of a gardener. Resilience gardening to me is foremost an existential exercise, a belief that we are each responsible for creating purpose or meaning or legacies in our own and others' lives through the gardens, landscapes, and green spaces that we create and steward. So to explore this topic, I'll tell you a story tonight. It's about one garden and its gardener and their evolution together through 3 decades of change and 3 seasons of understanding. The story goes like this. A long, long time ago, in the city of Seattle, there was a young man who simply loved plants. For him, plants were the thing. They were beautiful, reliable, wondrous, magical even, but he was frustrated because he had no garden. One day, through the luck or perhaps heavenly intervention, he wandered into an opportunity to purchase a residential property ideally suited, he thought, to create a garden where he could expand his knowledge of and experience with plants. Competing against bids from developers who proposed to redevelop the property, he submitted his bid, proposing instead to create a garden. And despite the lower bid, the owners accepted his proposal. And so our story begins in the springtime of this garden. So this garden is located in the city of Seattle. City of Seattle is among the most densified urban areas in the state of Washington. And it's located in a fairly old neighborhood, the Whittier Heights neighborhood, which is north of Ballard, south of the Crown Hill neighborhood. And you can see from this image that urban residential development here is intense. The amount of impermeable surfaces covering this watershed is up around 70%. Almost 3/4 of this watershed is paved over or covered with other impermeable structures, just to give you an idea of the intense level of development in this community. All small parcel residential, single family primarily development that initiated approximately in 1905, generally within this circle that I'm showing here. And then in earnest beginning about 1910. This is the location of the garden. This is what it looked like from an aerial photograph from 1936. You sort of get the idea of a developing neighborhood here with freshly laid streets and sidewalks. You have the beginnings of residential development on this particular parcel. You have a house that sits way back on the lots. There's a house close to the west, but there's a large open area to the east of that house, and there's also the presence of some what appear to be fairly large street trees, which is promising at this time. This is the aerial photograph, and it's the best image that I could come up with for this presentation. Sorry about that, but you still get the impression that not much has really happened on this parcel between 1990 and 1936. That structure is still present and visible here. There's a structure next door to it to the west, but most of that property is undeveloped. It would be lawn in 1990, and you'll notice that there's an absence of street trees. So most of those trees from 1936 have perished and have been replaced with other things, presumably turf, and in this case, junipers. Just to describe that garden a little better, it's again in a densely urbanized Whittier Heights neighborhood surrounded by dense urbanization. This effort of our gardener began in 1991, so some time ago, 32 years ago. It was essentially a blank slate for our gardener. There was soil present, obviously, but soil that had been neglected for decades, having not been stewarded in terms of compaction or fertility or organic matter. There were essentially few plants on the property, just literally bad turf, some rose bushes, a lilac, and some junipers. There was no provision for circulation. There was no diversity of space. There was no hardscape, essentially, which was sort of a good thing if you're constructing a garden from scratch. It was clearly a public space. It occupied a corner lot in this megalopolis. And so you had traffic on a side street as well as along a major thoroughfare, and lots of pedestrian activity on the sidewalks that passed through this and along this property. In 1991, when our gardener purchased the property, it was a hot, sunny, and dry place during the growing season. There was no shade to be had. Over time, that space evolved into a cool, shady, and dry environment, as I'll be describing tonight in our story. The story is about transformation. It's about the transformation of a habitat wasteland to a habitat of abundance, where you have now over 40 species of birds that have been observed, countless invertebrates, especially bees, dipterans, wasps, and spiders, a lot of mammals, including squirrel, possum, rabbit, raccoon, and most lately we welcome coyote back to the neighborhood, which is very exciting. And in this transformation, plants feature importantly. It was all about plants for this gardener. And he dug deeply and began to plant. And over the years that this garden developed, he's counted on the order of about 1,000 different taxa that he's tried in this space. At one point, early in the development of the garden, he was growing 500 different things in a very small urban space. Today, that's a little less, but includes small collections of important shade genera such as hosta and epimediums. The garden also focuses on native species and not being snobbish, our gardener was interested in a wide array of native species. And so those include rare, unusual, and even the most common native plant species. So just to be clear, the garden was not a native plant garden, but it was definitely a garden with native plants. And those native and non-native plants coexist peacefully, as illustrated in this image, for example. The garden continued to grow and develop over the years, and our gardener learned much from his plants. If there was a philosophy that described this springtime, it might have been Mary Oliver's instructions for living a life. You may have come across this. It was a very simple and memorable set of instructions. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And indeed, he did pay attention, and he was astonished. And when people began asking how he developed such a garden and what he was growing and who was using it, he began to tell about it by explaining to visitors, by teaching classes, and generally describing how beautiful, reliable, wondrous, and magical the plants were in his garden. He even captured his gardening methods in a public presentation called Kick-Butt Gardening. And this was about 1996 that this happened. Kick-Butt Gardening, in his mind, was an approach that attempted to maximize the production and aesthetics of gardening while minimizing human effort and unnatural inputs. And so I show you this from long ago. We go through some of these. I might explain what he might have intended by including those in his fundamental code of kick-butt gardening. So right at the top, stewarding your soil, critical. Organic matter is essential. And this is a topic that this webinar series has explored, and one that I'll speak a little more to later in this presentation. Our gardener in his newly created garden spent about 2 years, as Ann B. Clay did, just focusing on revitalizing, restoring the soil environment. The gardener would go to the Washington Park Arboretum in the fall and collect and bag leaves. Oak leaves and beech leaves were ideal for this purpose. And he stuffed those in his little car. And after multiple trips, dumping vast amounts of leaves onto his soil, newly tilled to receive that organic matter, he began to see his soil come back to life, developing a dark color indicating the accumulation of organic matter, and seeing life, wee beasties actually inhabiting the soil. And in that process, managing compaction and creating new planting areas that would receive his plants. Mulch was critical in this code. You never leave soil bare, as nature does, never leave soil bare. So emulating nature, there was a strong emphasis in the code about mulching. Our gardener actually tested a wide variety of mulches and developed his own proprietary mix of materials that worked in his garden just perfectly. A half and half mix of extra fine bark and compost. His first task was to eliminate or minimize turf. As you might recall, the aerial photograph showed that the property was mostly turf. That quickly left the scene, and he got zoned. He planned it. He had areas that he knew he would be irrigating, like a vegetable garden, and he had areas that he knew would not need to be irrigated. He knew that there were areas that needed to be tilled, and areas that would not need to be tilled, areas that might need pesticide usage and areas that didn't. So he began to plan it, get zoned. He was informed. He knew the limiting factors of his site and his plants. He was a horticulturist, so he understood disease and insect resistance of the materials that he was planting, adaptability to local soils, cold hardiness of that material, drought tolerance, right plant, right place, the stuff that Marcia Rivers Smith talked about in her webinar. In this garden and in his code, it was about conserving and harvesting water. On this hot and dry site, his emphasis was not to have to irrigate because it requires infrastructure, it requires time and money. And so he wanted to avoid that. So conserving and harvesting water was important in this code. He espoused intensiveness, again, mimicking nature. If you go out into the forest, you'll find rarely ground that's not covered by vegetation. And so planting densely was an important aspect of kick butt gardening philosophy. He espoused tolerance and patience. So if something is struggling in the garden and requires a little extra attention or some extra resources, give it a chance. Be patient, be tolerant, but not too patient. And this led to the next item in the code. It's about being ruthless. And that's a critical piece actually for a garden that is resilient, adaptive to changing conditions or conditions that exist in a garden. If something isn't doing well, or if you find yourself perpetually hacking on a plant, that's a good sign that maybe you need to reduce your opportunity costs and take advantage of space where something can be put where it'll thrive and be fruitful. He also espoused fanaticism, frugality, boldness. So scrounge, beg, trade, barter, raid, salvage, refuse, reuse, and recycle. So reusing materials was an important part of this code. And lastly, he encouraged folks to be creative and innovative, to basically embrace that concept of garden as an expression of you, your personality, your desires and likes and capabilities. So this was the code of kick butt gardening that our gardener used to interact with visitors and folks who had an interest in understanding how to create such a garden. And this is along the lines of how that transformation undertook. And so this was formerly all turf, and now, as illustrated here, a wide variety of plants with patterns for human circulation, reused materials, recycled materials, and so forth. But then one day, a gardener looked up from his plants and he discovered that the garden had become an important source of food, shelter, and beauty for a wide range of residents and visitors, from the abundant insects and spiders and mammals and birds to the humans that came from near and far just to visit his garden. Springtime had turned to summer as he realized his strong focus on the plant life, had failed to acknowledge the outsized benefit that his garden contributed to the urban ecosystem and human community in which it existed. If there was a philosophy that described our gardener's summer season, it might not have been better said than by Mark Veeder. You might know Mark Veeder's name. He calls himself a plant-obsessed gardener. He has a web presence and he gardens in upstate New York. Actually, it could have been said better. And so our gardener revised his quote to be readable, but the spirit remains. I have to say that I'm really puzzled that so many horticultural authors write so obtusely and effusively. But here it is. And at the time, I was very inspired by this and appreciated the spirit in which Mark attempted to describe his experience. And I was experiencing the same thing. My garden is my live performance and monologue, ever changing and never ending. The cast is me and the plants, the people and the wildlife interacting with us, the stories evolving from each moment, the emotions immortalized in every vista, and the memories married to every plant. So that sort of fit my, or the gardener's philosophy at this time. Finally realizing that it may be not just about the plants, that it's larger than just the stuff that grows in the garden, that actually there are benefits that well exceed just the vegetation that's present. And so he continued to grow and change over those years. Our gardener continued to teach and learn from his plants, but also from their interactions with each other and other residents in the garden and from its human visitors. And he was pleased. But then one day, our gardener happened to hear a presentation from a gentleman named Dr. Robert Lackey. He was talking about salmon conservation. Bob Lackey is a well-known researcher in salmon conservation. He spent most of his life studying the lives and conservation of salmon in the Pacific Northwest. And Dr. Lackey stands out among folks that do that for a living, and that he is extremely forthright about the future prospects of salmon here in the Pacific Northwest. His presentation was captivating because he was speaking about things that we are never to speak about. His message, like in the indigenous peoples before him, was, we go the way the salmon go. So his message, and the message from our salmon and orca brothers and sisters, is that things are not going well. People fail to realize that what happens on land affects what happens in the water. So Bob talked about 4 realities that we don't talk about. And I'm going to talk about 3 of them here, the ones that really struck me. The first is, the first reality that we should never speak about is that human population growth in Salish land, and Salish land, this is a reminder, is that watershed that includes the Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and Puget Sound. So it's a border spanning watershed. The human population growth in Salish land will continue unabated, both driving and constraining the future of the Salish Sea. Or, in other words, aggressive growth management, such as immigration and maternal birth rates and so forth, completely off the table. The second reality, of which we shall not speak, is that standards of living must be maintained, if not enhanced, or consumerism and growth economies must persist at all costs. And then the third reality that we shall not speak about is changing climate will alter both the Salish Sea and Salish land, or, in other words, we will surpass climate change tipping points. Well, these are pretty jarring points to hear for a gardener who's well enmeshed in his garden and happy with what's going on there, but strongly focused on just his little piece of land, his minuscule parcel on this planet Earth. To elaborate a little bit on these points, I think it's helpful to show some numbers and some interpretations of this. It helped me to understand what Bob was getting at. So, for example, it's easy to think about the here and now, but it's more challenging to think about what this place will look like in 40 years or 120 years. And so if we do some of the numbers and look at some of the research and forecasts for population growth in this region, we note that the population of the city of Seattle, for example, doubles approximately every 40 years. So it was 1.8 million people in 1982 when I arrived actually in this region. It's currently about 3.5 million in 2023. And if that trend continues, it will be 14 million people in the year 2103. You think about that, that is just hard to contemplate. 14 million people living within the city of Seattle. Where is everybody going to live? What kind of impact will that have on urban forests, green spaces, and gardens? To broaden our view a little bit, in Salish land, again, that nation-spanning watershed, it's about 9 million people today in Salish land, 25 to 30 million in 2100. That's the forecast. It'll be a tripling or more of human population here in the Salish Sea watershed. And what's important to understand in all of that is that governments, agencies are planning to accommodate that increase in population. And essentially what that means is that choices regarding land and water are critical. Everybody acknowledges that, but land use planning is still based on an endless frontier vision that considers ecosystems a subset of the economy capable of sustaining never-ending growth. If you look at conservation plans for salmon, never is this topic mentioned, the future growth of humans in this region and how that will affect the prospects for the survival of salmon here. In terms of standards of living, all of those new folks will be arriving here with probably high expectations for having reasonable standards of living. Many of those people will have significant disconnection to the environment around them. In fact, as it is now, making the connection between human activity on land and its effect on waters of the Salish Sea has been really challenging. They've been trying to do it, for example, in Chesapeake Bay watershed for over 40 years. And just now, the alignment of scientific, social, and political tools is beginning to affect cleanup, even as human population there accelerates. But we're not even close here in the Puget Sound and Salish Sea watershed in beginning to think seriously about how to align such tools to minimize and avoid the impact of human development here. And if you look at those people, you see some interesting trends. I actually did a presentation to a group that was associated with the green industry, the landscape industry. And I was able to get into some of the research that industry has been doing about how their consumers are changing through time and what they might look like in the future. And their forecasts for what the future consumer looks like was pretty interesting to me as a gardener. And they should be interesting to you as someone interested in gardening and natural spaces. So they anticipate that fewer consumers will be interested in gardening. And in fact, as we see in our own neighborhoods, there's increasingly less space to garden. There'll be less consumer interest in environmental awareness, landscape appreciation, and sense of place. That's happened in the 40 years that I've been here, as the city of Seattle and the surrounding region has become tech focused, and I'm not the only one to note that change. There'll be changing consumer expectations from purchasing way of life products, as it has been in the past, to instantaneous gratification products. Increasingly zero attention spans due to technology options and faster paces of life. And it's estimated that people will be living in increasingly densified urban areas, obviously, but there will be fewer able-bodied and interested folks generally focused on gardening. So pretty astonishing forecasts for how the human population of the Pacific Northwest will be as we head into the future. And then that third point that Bob was making about climate change, you know, if you again read the literature, people are still hoping against hope that humans will choose to act differently, and as a result, prevent the globe from reaching critical tipping points in terms of climate change. Bob's point is that we should just forget about that we're going to get there. And so we all should understand what is forecasted in terms of climate change for the Pacific Northwest. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but everybody should understand that summer temperatures are increasing, winter temperatures are increasing, which means less precipitation in the mountains falling as snow, drier summers, wetter winters, so not only less snow, but more rain, particularly in our mountain watersheds. More precipitation is rain rather than snow, which is important for water supply for humans as well as other animals, and more intense storm events. And I don't probably have to show you some of the gory details on that, but there's just an abundance of evidence that, in fact, those forecasts are coming true, that annual temperatures are increasing, as shown by this image on the left. Snow water equivalents are declining, and the timing, center of mass, and annual river runoff in snowmelt basins is happening days earlier. And these are time periods that are focused on the late 40s through the early 2000s. We have more current data that reinforce what's happening out there, these very trends. So Bob's message was jarring for our gardener, really sort of spooked him. It forced him to look beyond the garden walls, beyond his minuscule little piece of the earth, to reflect on his own mortal trajectory and the implications for the future of his garden. Lifting his head further, he recalls numerous friends and neighbors now deceased and how their gardens have been transformed or destroyed, with few exceptions. And I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. You've seen this too among friends and neighbors. He sees this change as he looks outside his garden walls, just blocks away, for example, in his neighborhood. Entire blocks are transforming from single-family residential properties, shown here in 2021, to the image here on the right. These very tightly congested, mostly single-family residences. What's obvious to a gardener or someone interested in natural spaces immediately in the view on the right from 2022 is that there's nary a space for gardening, not a space even for trees. The vegetation you see there is retained from previous residential developments. And so this is happening very rapidly as the city of Seattle and other communities are attempting to accommodate growing populations, the so-called missing middle housing issue. You're probably aware, reading in recent media, that the state legislature recently passed legislation that is encouraging this kind of intense development, particularly in cities within those areas that are managed under the Growth Management Act in the state of Washington. So he sees this change coming and realizes that in the absence of the authority or stature of a say an Art Krukeberg or the moneyed wealth of a Betty Miller, gardens 20, 30, 40, or even 50 years or more in the making are doomed to fall to the vagaries of human population growth, neglect, invasive species, climate change, and other disturbances. What of resilience then, he thinks? What of it then, he thinks? So our gardener began to contemplate responses that might ensure the future of his garden, or a garden, if it wasn't his. Is the answer a conservation easement prevents redevelopment? Is it a hand-chosen successor? Someone with similar motivations, philosophies, and physical capacities to create and manage a garden? Or is it something else? Or is it nothing else? And does it even matter? For our gardener, summer had turned to autumn. And if there's a philosophy that might describe this season, it might be a revision of Mark Viter's statement, and in which the gardener's presence begins to fade. Still my garden, still my live performance and monologue, ever changing, but soon to end. And the cast is me and the plants and the people and wildlife interacting with my plants. So in contemplating these options, though, our gardener began to realize that he might do well to conduct his gardening in a place more resilient in the face of these challenges. And so he turned to the nearest public green space, which happened to be the city's largest park, which is called Discovery Park. And it's here that our gardener began and continues to hone his skills in restoring soil food webs, establishing restoration plantings, managing invasive plant species, experimenting with novel plant communities comprised of both native as well as non-native species, and so much more. There, he's experienced memorable and important encounters in natural history involving species not present in his urban garden, things like osprey, hawk and heron, mountain beaver, vole and mouse, barred, and barn owls. Has enjoyed many fruitful interactions and long-time relationships with other human forest stewards striving towards similar goals. So here you see Discovery Park. I've outlined it for you. Discovery Park is the city of Seattle's largest park, approximately 750 acres in size. It is managed primarily for its natural resources. But the park, as you see, is a sea of nature. Well, no, it's an island of nature and a sea of urban development, well distant from other intact natural areas. So it's a really interesting place, a natural area in a city. And it also has a very interesting human legacy. When the colonial settlers arrived in Puget Sound, this area was covered with typical old growth, low elevation coniferous forest, primarily red cedar and hemlock and Douglas fir, maybe some spruce, some grand fir. But when the Army, the U.S. federal government, decided to create a fort here, they chose this site, and just before 1900 began clearing the old growth forest from essentially all of the land that they acquired here for that fort purpose, and began constructing a fort. This is an image showing Discovery Park in 1936, when in fact, actually many of the buildings had already been torn down. So there was intense development activity between 1900 and about 1930. It was an important place for troops as they were processed coming from and going to various locations in World War I and World War II. So Discovery Park has an important legacy, a series of legacies actually from that very recent human use. And it's important in doing restoration work at Discovery Park to acknowledge those legacies in terms of the removal of native vegetation, an intense bottleneck in which biological diversity was reduced. So not just vascular plants, not just animals above the soil surface, but those wee beasties that lived in the soil profile. There are parts of Discovery Park that haven't seen a woody plant for decades. And so presents really an interesting laboratory for a restorationist wanting to understand how to restore a place so intensively disturbed, so racked with adverse legacies from past human use. And for our gardener, this was just an ideal laboratory for exploring those aspects of plants and growth and restoration. For example, Discovery Park is dominated by non-native species. I'll just tell you that. And part of our gardener's experimentation there has been to plant non-native species to observe how they perform as potential restoration species in this island of nature in an urban sea of development. So I just show you this because it's somewhat interesting. Some interesting native species, things that are not native to King County, but native to Western Washington and Oregon, but also some things that are native to California and beyond. And these kinds of experiences have been very informative for our gardener in understanding the legacies that really form restoration activities there, and understanding how Discovery Park might be restored to useful, functional ecosystems in the future. So it has been in these very two different and very similar places where our gardener digs into the earth to discover the rich treasure of experience and knowledge about plants, but also animals and humans. It's this information that forms his thoughts about his role here. wherein lay his spheres of influence and what it means to garden resiliently, adaptively. When asked, he'll share a few important lessons from those years. And so these are the top lessons, the top 6 lessons that come to his mind when asked what he might share with other people interested in gardening adaptively, resiliently, and in restoration. Top of the list, healthy soil food webs are critical. So here's a quote from Williamson. Soils represent the greatest reservoir of biological diversity on the planet. Prokaryotic diversity in soils is estimated to be 3 orders of magnitude greater than in all other ecosystems combined. Astonishing statement. Soils remain the most poorly understood ecosystems on Earth. And there's the link to that research. Clearly, from our gardener's experience, depleted soil organic carbon, soil compaction, and poorly developed soil food webs are the main limiting factors for plant growth in urban areas. But those concepts are completely off the radar for most restorationists, gardeners, horticulturists, and landscape professionals. Just off the radar, not contemplated at all. But those are critical to supporting plant growth and biological diversity. Within the discussion, our gardener notes that practitioners' use of wood chips is based on misconception and narrow understanding of the function of wood in and on soil. This is a topic that I've spoken on widely, the use of wood chips as a soil amendment to kickstart healthy soil food webs. Informed strategic use of wood chips has potential to importantly transform ecosystem restoration as well as ornamental landscaping. I should mention something that came up in Ann B. Clay and David Montgomery's talk on Monday, and they mentioned that there were commercial versions of mycorrhizal fungi that were available for inoculating plants and establishing soil food webs. But the research, actually, very recent research, is showing that commercial formulations of those mycorrhizal fungi are ineffective, or they can even be detrimental. That is to say, they actually decrease plant growth. So be cautious when you're using commercial formulations of fungi. I'll just add that as a postscript to their presentation. Certainly use local organic matter or make your own compost. Worms are not necessary and might even be detrimental because they're able to process organic matter so quickly. In some places, earthworms are considered an invasive species and are causing extreme environmental damage. Minimize soil cultivation and disturbance. Fungal colonies have difficulty reestablishing after disturbance, and that's why you hear about the benefits of no-till farming techniques. One of the benefits of no-till is that you don't disturb those soil food web communities, and so they don't have to reestablish after a deep tillage event. But sometimes you need to actually cultivate to address soil compaction, for example, or to kickstart a soil food web. And remember, if you remove organic matter, for example, if you clean up your garden, as you probably are compelled to do in a small urban garden every fall or winter, make sure you replace it with mulch. That's what I do in my garden, and avoid leaving bare soil. Nature never leaves bare soil unless there's some ongoing issues or processes happening. There's an apparent need for increased sophistication in the identification, natural histories, and landscape restoration uses of native and non-native plants out there. So what this lesson has been for our gardener is that people don't know their subjects. If they're a gardener or a restorationist, one of your main tools is the plant life that you use to do those activities. But few people are truly skilled in identification of those beasts, their natural histories, and how they're used in those activities. When I have taught plant identification to students, I taunt them with this provocative statement. The intelligent, considered species selection solves any landscape or restoration design challenge. I'll let that sink in for a minute. And so what I'm saying there is that there are plants, assemblages of plants, if those species are carefully selected, that can solve any landscape or restoration design challenge. To be able to do that, you need to be sophisticated in your mastery of the subjects that you work with, the plants. So do the hard work of learning your plant materials. Disallow horticultural one-upmanship and bioexploitation. That's something that our gardener has been dismayed with over the years. This competition among gardeners to outdo, to out-collect other gardeners. And it's a sad situation when the horticulturists go around the world and collect plant materials for introduction in their home countries, but don't acknowledge that collection in ways that respect the countries and the peoples that live in those countries. So disallow horticultural one-upmanship and bioexploitation. Be mindful, by the way, of future invasive species. You know, the green industry continues to introduce countless non-native species, always without any kind of examination for their potential to be invasive species in the future. So just be mindful that many of the things that you're finding that are exciting in the trade could become the future's invasive species that'll be causing ecological or economic damage. Creatively solve design challenges, particularly plant combinations designed for maintenance, wildlife habitat, extended seasonal interest. Be intentional about the plants that you include in your garden and restoration work. Species diversity can be at odds with uniformity. That's often a key element in landscape design, particularly those that are professionally engaged in landscape design. But, you know, urban sites are custom made for plant diversity, embracing not just natives, but non-natives as well. The vast majority of plants in urban areas are non-native, and there's a huge diversity that benefits humans as well as other organisms dramatically. Remember that your landscape is infrastructure. It's green infrastructure. It's part of the ecological urbanism that we all engage in and rely on. So things like carbon sequestration, production of oxygen, the management of stormwater, all of those things critical for living in urban places and our world, it turns out. And so that reminds me to remind you that restoration of the urban forest is critical, and will be increasingly critical as the future unfolds. Another lesson, garden for others. You know, your garden is not just your private space. Its benefits are shared with countless seen and unseen human visitors and passerby, as well as birds, mammals, insects of all sorts, spiders and mites, worms and nematodes, and myriad other beasts. It's really a de facto public space and wildlife habitat, and you're just really its temporary steward. So adopt garden design and management strategies that benefit wildlife and humans. So leave areas. That's a tension that I've had to manage in my own garden. My preference is in my small urban garden to clean it through the winter time, but that's not all that amenable to encouraging insects or bird life. So there are areas that I've identified where I just don't touch them. I let them do whatever they're going to do, and I don't remove the dead plant material. I don't remove the duff in those areas. And that's worked out for me. Even in my small urban garden, I've been able to find areas where I can leave those sites to nature and not intensively cultivate them. Provide water, food, shelter. Remember the other beasts that use your garden. Focus on complexity, plant diversity, as well as diversity of structure. So we're talking about ground cover layers, shrub layers, understory tree layers, and overstory tree layers, really critical to supporting other life forms and creating an interesting aesthetic in urban settings. Be chemical free. It can be done. Be irrigation free completely. It can be done. You can be turf free. You can be pavement free. And you can plant plants that amaze and delight. both humans as well as animals. So remember, you garden for others effectively, and you're just a temporary steward of your minuscule parcel of land. The other thing that our gardener would remind you is beware dogma. There's usually no right or wrong answer. Gardening and restoration are really messy, nuanced, context and objective based activities. And it really is important to be able to think for yourself and try different things, observe, learn, adapt. If I had stayed tuned to what I was taught, that if you incorporate wood into the soil, that wood will steal the nitrogen, then I would never have learned that incorporating wood chips into soil profiles enhance survivability of your plantings, particularly in restoration sites that are not irrigated, and kickstarts healthy soil food webs. Just a reminder too, under Beware Dogma, that the science is exciting. It's complicated. We don't know it all, but engage the science. There's just a remarkable amount of information that's coming out now, particularly due to technological improvements and understanding, for example, relationships among organisms, techniques like genetic tests and laboratory processes that allow us to fully understand more completely than we ever have who is where and what they're doing. So the science is very exciting. Engage the science, ask questions. What I will sometimes do, again, when I'm talking about native plants and engaged in conversation about whether native plants are superior to non-native plants, I will tease that discussion by suggesting that you show me any native plant and I'll show you a native plant that does it better. Is that provocative? Well, it should be. So if you, for example, want to increase the pollinators that are attracted to your garden, just sheer quantities of pollinators, there is no plant in our King County flora, for example, better than this plant, Scrophularia nodosa, European figwort, non-native species. It by far, light years ahead of native plants and being able to attract abundance of pollinators. You say that you would like a conifer that's well adapted to our summer dry conditions. And you might say, well, Douglas fir, perfect species for that. I would counter that deodar cedar is perhaps even more finely tuned to our climate here, and particularly a warming climate, than is Douglas fir. But then it's all nuanced, right? And it's context and objective based. So if your objective is not to attract as many bees, wasps, dipterans, and other pollinators to your garden, but you're interested in specific pollinators, then Scrophularia nodosa is probably not the plant that you want. It'll be something different. It'll probably be a native plant that would accomplish that particular objective within the context of your garden. If you're interested in attracting native birds, for example, science has shown through research that native birds are attracted to native conifers when it comes to a choice between native conifers and non-native conifers. And so again, gardening and restoration are messy, nuanced, context and objective based. It's really all about context. And then another lesson is that social fabrics, attention spans, knowledge levels change. There's a breathtaking need to continually teach people, youth, newcomers, novices, whoever is interested in needing that information, in what's happening in their ecosystems, both their cultivated ecosystems as well as their so-called wild ecosystems in urban environments. So acknowledge your own levels of interest and knowledge in the natural world, gardening and environmental issues, and continually improve your knowledge in those realms. And part of that is being a capable natural historian. What that means is being a keen observer of nature and relationships among species, contemplating the legacies of past land use and how that affects what you're observing today and what you might observe in the future. There's a real crisis, I would say, of natural history around the world, including here in the US of A. Natural history used to be an important aspect of science, but now is increasingly reduced to sidelines, where we have fewer and fewer people that are keen observers of nature and relationships among species. Well, we can change that. And then once you acknowledge your own levels of interest, improve your levels of interest in gardening and environmental issues in the natural world, and to become a keen natural historian, you can communicate that information in compelling, engaging, practical ways to people, including youth. Again, going back to Mary Oliver's advice, pay attention, be astonished, and then tell about it. So mentor and assist youth, neighbors, and students. Publish your thoughts and information. Collaborate with others of like mind, and teach. Really important as we head into a future where population will be dramatically changing from what it has been in the past in terms of its interests and abilities and capacities. And then perhaps lastly, the lesson might be from our gardener that your efforts may not linger long in the face of changes in ownership and land uses, and the relentless pressure to redevelop properties to accommodate unconstrained human population growth and poor lifestyle choices. So the tactics in this lesson might include being prepared. So what that meant for our gardener is acknowledging his mortality, acknowledging that his garden will very likely not exist without his presence, and begin to plan for that. What does that mean? Does that mean protecting your property from redevelopment? Does it mean finding a suitable suitor that can take over in that activity and create a garden of their own design? Seek ways to prevent or delay redevelopment. It means advocating for the preservation of trees, gardens, and green spaces, as they will continue to be under pressure from the increasing human population and human activity. Work in locations known to be relatively secure from threats of redevelopment. And so our gardener turned to an important natural space in the city of Seattle, and you have no doubt options to do that as well. And I think we all realize that public spaces often are underfunded, poorly maintained, and even neglected, and they could use a little volunteer help. Keep in mind, every plant counts, and this was important to our gardener. He realized that he should have been planting a lot more trees much earlier in his life than he did. So plant sooner rather than later, and ask what can I do within my spheres of the spheres of my own influence and abilities. It might mean that you're physically able to plant trees. It may mean that you have a good grasp of natural history and are an excellent teacher, a good mentor. It might mean that you're good in research and can deliver useful information to people. It's about doing what you can with the life that you've got and arriving here at my concluding statements. So I'm just going to read a couple of sentences that I thought would be useful to wrap this up. And I have to say, I hope this presentation wasn't too depressing. I did a talk on this similar talk to a green gardening group, a green landscaping group, and after I went through Bob Lackey's points about things we never talk about, and I wrapped up with some positive points. There was just dead silence in the room, which is unusual for my presentations. But so there's some bad news in this presentation, but I think there's also some good news. And my concluding statements would go along this line. And I've actually written them out because I think it's important to be purposeful about how I wrap this up. So I start out by saying, if humans are hell-bent on developing every last square foot, then what's the point of creating, as Mary Reynolds hopes, a patchwork quilt of sanctuaries that wraps around the globe, or a homegrown national park, as Dr. Doug Tallamy preaches? This may sound a bit odd, but I'm reminded of Orson Welles' quote from his movie F for Fake. Most people haven't seen that, but his soliloquy in this film is somewhat well known. He says, "Everything must fall in war or wear away into ash. A fact of life, we're going to die. Be of good heart," cry the dead artists out of the living past. "Our songs will all be scienced. But what of it? Go on singing." Our gardener and many others say, go on gardening. Every square foot does matter. Every desired tree, shrub, and plant matters, even if for a short time, even in the most densified, urbanized, and ecologically forlorn places, and they matter more with each passing day. Strive to achieve resilience by being intentional and strategic in your gardening practices, keen in your abilities as a natural historian, strong as an advocate for preserving plants and green space, passionate in sharing your skills and knowledge. If resilience is to be found in our gardens, landscapes, and green spaces, it will be found in their gardeners' generosity over stinginess, productivity over consumption, and generativity over exploitation. At the core of this topic, however, is how to make a case for plants, those beautiful, reliable, wondrous, magical even creatures. Our case must acknowledge society's pervasive plant apathy that results in underappreciation and neglect of plants, gardens, landscapes, and green spaces everywhere. And we must champion the role plants have in addressing the many challenges facing humanity today as we face tomorrows full of uncertainty. So I want to thank you all for your attention tonight, and that is much appreciated. I am going to turn it back to Julie at this point, and we'll continue with questions and answers. Hopefully I'll have answers.
Thank you, Clay. That was very thought-provoking and insightful. And thank you so much. Your photos are very inspiring. So I think you've got a lot of comments in the chat we'll get to in a few minutes. First, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us this month. And I'd like to invite everyone to a program in May by author Douglas Tallamy. It will take place on Friday, May 5th at 4 p.m. The topic will be a homegrown national park. So if you haven't heard about that, you can find out much more about it. It is a grassroots call to action to regenerate biodiversity and ecosystem function by planting native plants and creating new ecological networks. The goal is to recruit anyone with land, from home gardeners to farmers, to grow habitat by planting native plants, and all are invited to attend. So please pre-register at wnps.org. And now Clay will take questions, and I'll read those to you here. I've previewed a few of them while you were presenting. So let me go to the top. Which areas in Discovery Park have you specifically restored with your mulching and other testing experiences?
Yeah, that's great. I love to get into the weeds, so to speak, at Discovery Park. So I've been doing forest stewardship work there since 2006. Initially at a sort of a snail's pace and at a very small scale. Initially, I was working in the Wolf Tree area, which is in the north of the park, just north of the north parking lot. And I did a lot of invasive removal there and understory planting. I found that understory planting was not rewarding because the conifers that I installed basically just sat there in the shade. They grew just a couple of inches each year. And I thought the progress was too slow, and I was getting old, and that was a concern to me. So I switched to an area that is nothing but grass. And if you know where Bird Alley is, that's south of the horse barns that are still there at Discovery Park. I sort of use that as my nucleus, and then have been restoring the grassy areas surrounding Bird Alley. And I have been amazed by what I've learned in working in the sun, working in basically a non-native grassland, attempting to establish woody plants. It's very, very challenging, but once they're established, and establishment, by the way, for me means largely incorporating wood into my planting spots and watching those guys take off. Once they take off, they grow extremely fast, and that's been just very rewarding for me. So that's two areas that I've worked in, and I've also worked in an area called Spruce Island, which is north of the Bird Alley, and hard to describe those areas if I don't have a map, but if you know Discovery Park, you'll know those areas. Spruce Island was an interesting thing for me. It was overrun by blackberries, and because forest stewards are not allowed to use chemical controls or motorized devices, all of that hand clearing work was done by me and one other volunteer. And we did our planting after clearing all of that blackberry. And immediately the blackberry just came back. And that was discouraging to me. Again, having a lot of labor, very unpleasant labor, really, and your plants being covered and smothered, killed by blackberry was very discouraging to me. So I went back to Bird Alley, and that's where I sort of focused my work today, where I can see plants effectively establishing, beginning to crowd out that non-native grass community and beginning to form habitat. And that's been very rewarding. All told, everything that I've done at Discovery Park has been a great learning experience for me. It's been a delight from the natural history that I've experienced there, as I've talked about tonight, and really have enjoyed working with the other forest stewards that have like mind and goals. It's been a great experience, and I would encourage all of you, if you don't already volunteer in your local green spaces, to do so. You'll learn a lot and contribute importantly.
So next question, Scott asks, will you make your slideshow and book recommendations available? And I can answer that yes. This program has been recorded. So just keep an eye on the WNPS website for virtual programs. And it usually takes a couple days, and we're at the end of the week. So check back next week and you can watch the program again. We have—
I'm also, Julie, I'm also happy to provide a PowerPoint of that presentation. And I'm also delighted to provide a PowerPoint presentation and accompanying article related to the next question about the use of wood chips.
Mhm.
So if there is one thing that I've learned in my 40 years of experience here in the Pacific Northwest, is it's all about stewarding soil. And for me, if you're attempting to establish woody vegetation, critical to have a healthy soil based healthy soil food web that's predominantly fungus dominated, because those beasties become important mycorrhizal associates for the woody plants that you're growing there. It's also known, though, that mycorrhizal fungi are critical for herbaceous plant growth as well. So if I might just jump to the next question from anonymous attendee.
Sure.
I like the
trees when modern construction methods are so lethal to trees?
Oh, wait, I missed you. Where are you here?
Okay,
I was going to go elaborate on the use of wood chips.
Yes, okay. We have 3 questions about wood chips. Elaborate on the use of wood chips. I use them a lot. What kind of mulch should we use? Arborist chips with leaves, etc. And can you speak more about the pros and cons of using arborist wood chips, chip drops? So three on that topic.
Yeah. So, I have spoken widely about the use of wood chips as a soil amendment. Everybody knows that wood chips are a great mulch, right? But when you start talking about people on the topic of incorporating wood chips as a soil amendment, the conversation quickly turns to a phenomenon that is deeply ingrained in the human psyche. It's very interesting to explore that psychologically, Julie. I would love to do that. How it became so deeply ingrained. I will speak till I'm blue in the face about incorporating wood chips as a soil amendment. People will be nodding, and then at the end of our conversation, they say, "Oh, okay, but I think the wood chips will steal the nitrogen." Not the case. Not the case at all. Wood chips provide food for the fungus and the nitrogen fixing bacteria that are in the soil. And those beasties are critical to healthy soil food webs. So what I'm talking about is the use of wood chips as a soil amendment. Strongly encourage their use as a mulch, but also strongly encourage their use to address soil compaction and kickstarting healthy soil food webs. So I would ask those folks, Victoria and Elise and Anonymous, to reach out. I'd be happy to provide a PowerPoint presentation that I do and an article that I wrote that backs up that information. That's really so critical to understand the role of wood in soil. And it's not just, my experience. There are many other people out there, including scientific researchers, who are documenting the importance of wood in supporting a healthy soil food web and good plant growth.
Okay.
The pros and cons
ready?
of using arborist wood chips. Generally, any wood is good wood. If you can't get wood chips, then bark is okay. Despite what other folks in this webinar series have said. It just needs to be clean, meaning not contaminated with pollutants or salt, and not full of garbage like plastic and stuff. So any wood is good wood. If you can't get wood, then bark is a good acceptable substitute. It just takes longer to do its thing, but it still does its thing. Okay, back to you, Julie.
Oh, okay. Could you comment about Emma Maris's book, Rambunctious Garden, Saving Nature in a Post-Wild World?
I have to say that I haven't touched that, so I'm not qualified to speak upon it. Julie, have you studied that one?
It's been a while since I've looked at it, and I don't feel comfortable commenting unless I looked at it more recently. So,
Fair enough.
So how do we preserve trees? I share this question when modern construction methods are so lethal to trees. I'm shared that concern. It's really a big problem.
Yeah. So I can speak to that as one of my roles over the years has been to advise on protecting trees. I'm not an arborist, but I know enough about it to advise on that. And we have techniques now that are generally proven to protect trees during construction. It's that often those techniques are not deployed. Arborists are not employed to advise on how to protect trees. And so there really needs to be a more intense focus on engaging certified arborists in advising on how to protect trees, and then basically policing the deployment of tree protection methods. I in the city of Seattle, I worked for the city's building department for a couple of years and had the opportunity to see how the city required tree protection, and it all looks great on plan, but then you go out to the construction site and it looks completely different. The tree protection methods are not deployed or poorly deployed. Trees are suffering. And so it's not just about understanding what the methods should be, hiring qualified people to advise on those, but it's also about ensuring during construction that those methods are employed. In the city of Seattle, we're struggling right now with the development of a new tree ordinance. We've had a temporary tree ordinance in place for over 12 years, which is pretty amazing and undesirable. So now the city council is just getting around to establishing a new tree ordinance that is, I would say, controversial in that it attempts to protect trees more than our current provisions do, but it also attempts to accommodate this wave of growth as anticipated. And so largely people who have reviewed this draft proposal are suggesting that the trees that will suffer most are the largest trees on residential properties. But I would say, again, certified arborists can back me up on this, that even large trees, if the proper methods for protection are deployed, can be preserved in the face of urban development. Again, it's a matter of correct methods and correctly policed.
So we have, what's a PHC?
Yeah, that's funny, isn't it? Yeah. So I took a master's at the University of Washington. I was the third graduate student taken on at the Center for Urban Horticulture in 1982. Finished that master's program and then went on to a PhD program. Well, the PhD program involves doing coursework for a couple of years and then taking a general exam. So I completed the coursework and successfully passed the general exam. And at that point, you're officially called a candidate for the PhD. And so I actually got a certificate and everything, Julie. And it says I'm a candidate for the PhD. And then I called the registrar and I say, could I actually call myself a PhC? And they said, yes, you can do that. Call yourself a PhC.
Gosh.
I mean, it's hard work, so why not take a little credit, right? I'm not a PhD. I just fell short. And you're probably wondering, Julie, why I fell short, why I didn't complete the PhD.
Things happen.
Yeah. Well, just for Anonymous's sake there, at that point, I'd been in school for like, what, 22 years or something. And there were a lot of politics in that particular department. And the final straw was that I was unable to get the dollars I needed to conduct my research that would have enabled me to complete my dissertation and then obtain the PhD. And then my son was born, and that put a topper on it, and I was done.
Yeah.
I needed to get a job, and I was sort of tired of being in school.
That's
so long.
how life happens like that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
there you
it
go.
happens.
Thanks for asking, Anonymous.
Now, here's an interesting question. Based on your understanding of the trajectory of climate change in our region, what native tree species are most likely to thrive in the next 100 years? Which are least likely to thrive in the next century?
Yeah. So that's from Van Bobbitt. Van, I like the cut of your jib on that question. You know, that's a wide open question. People are debating it widely. In my own opinion, I see hemlock struggling. I see cedar struggling. And this is all evident, by the way, if you travel to other parts of Western Washington, for example, if you travel into the rain shadow of the Olympic Mountains, you can see hemlock and cedar struggling there when you compare what they look like, say, 3 or 4 decades ago. So something's happening, and they appear to be suffering from the warmer, drier environments that we've been having recently. I think Douglas fir is really probably pretty good to go for the rest of this century. Grand fir, I have high hopes for. At Discovery Park, one of my amazing discoveries was that Sitka spruce has an amazing drought tolerance. And even though it has problems with a host of insects, it grows dramatically fast, is even more drought tolerant than Douglas fir, because I plant all of these things often together. It's always the one that survives. I have high hopes for Sitka spruce. But then if you're talking about native trees, we should also talk about those that maybe are native to southern portions of our region. Calocedrus decurrens, the incense cedar, an incredible plant. If you go along I-5 in the city of Seattle, you see it everywhere. It tolerates urban conditions like nothing else. So a great plant, gets as far north as Portland. I've actually seen it. I don't know if it's naturalized or a native plant, but I've seen it actually in Vancouver, Washington. So we might say that it's native to Washington. That's really an excellent drought tolerant thing, and probably one for the future. I would also add a couple of others here. What else? Let me go through my list. Ponderosa pine. I know you know this, Van, but ponderosa pine is actually native to Western Washington as well as Eastern Washington. And the material that's found in Western Washington is genetically distinct from the stuff that grows in Eastern Washington. and other places on the dry side of the mountains. That material is never made it into the trade, but it has the potential to be an important conifer in the Western Washington region, I think, into this century and beyond. So if there's an enterprising nurseryman out there, I think it would be very important to begin testing the Western Washington form of ponderosa pine. And then I am high also on giant sequoia and coast redwood. Of those, of course, those are California and Oregon natives. But I've put a couple of those in at Discovery Park. The coastal redwood, really difficult to establish for some reason, but I'm making some progress. And the giant sequoia, of course, is already there, forming beautiful, massive specimens. And I've taken the liberty of scattering a few more around just in case we need them in the next century. So that's a great question, Van. I appreciate that. Hopefully that gives you some food for thought.
Debbie wrote in, wow, Clay, that was such a thought-provoking, inspiring presentation. Thank you so much.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for attending and listening.
And could you please point us to any articles or books that you've written?
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing about me. I don't publish, and I haven't written books that I want you to buy. However, that might change soon. I have sufficient material now to probably write a book, and I've been encouraged by a number of people to do that. So I don't have much for you, but what I do have is a huge library of public presentations, so PDFs of PowerPoint presentations, and in some cases handouts that go along with that, on a huge array of topics, some of which I alluded to earlier tonight. And I'm happy to share any of that stuff with anybody who asks. I would say that my most important presentations have had to do with sophisticated and intelligent plant selection and wood chips as a soil amendment. Those are really important pieces of my philosophy.
So we have a question. Are you using certain plants to pull out toxins from the soil?
Yeah, I don't do that. I haven't done that in my professional or personal work. However, the science is pretty clear that plants do accumulate certain substances, and they have been using plants. For example, cottonwoods are great accumulators of certain toxins from the soil, or metals particularly. So there's a good body of science out there that I would direct you to, and I'm happy to assist you in getting to that. If you need my assistance, happy to advise on that. But if you just look at restoration, for example, mine lands, people are using a wide variety of plants to gather heavy metals, harvest that plant material, and then basically landfill it or otherwise deal with the metals in some way. You know, and then there are also plants that accumulate gold and silver. Did you know that? And so that's provocative, isn't it? That you might be able to harvest plant life that accumulates gold and silver and then become rich in that fashion after you extract those metals. So I don't have any personal experience.
How about prairie species, Gary oak and the grasses and herbaceous plants?
Yeah, there's much to say about those, Renee. And, you know, I would say that all of them, well, not all of them, but many of those prairie species, including Gary oak and many of the grasses that are found in those environments and the forbs, I have attempted to grow in my garden, or have at some time in the past, or continue to grow them. They're all easily cultivated. The challenge often is finding them in the nursery trade. So sometimes you just have to grow your own, but that's pretty easy because a lot of these things are easily propagated just with some cold stratification. So yeah, you know, it's pretty much all fair game out there. You want to be careful if you're collecting seed to not over collect seed. Be aware of what's rare, and take appropriate precautions if you're gathering seed from rare species. Otherwise, stick to what's in the nursery trade, and you'll be rewarded with success, because many of these prairie species, Gary Oaken gardens, and our native grasses, sedges, and forbs are very beautiful ornamental subjects, as well as useful restoration plants. I will say this though about this concept. Many people have a desire to establish a grassland, a native grassland community, a little prairie community. I'll say that that's very difficult to do. First, because most people aren't expert at identifying grasses, and so they're unable to identify the stuff that they've planted with the stuff that comes in as weeds. And so it all co-mixes, and then you end up with a weedy patch. And then the other reason is that you have this seed rain, where grasses are constantly coming into your space. And unless you're really prudent about weeding out those invasives, you end up with a weedy patch. And that's happened to me in restoration projects. Just really impossible to develop a pure native grass-dominated prairie project because of all the invasive grasses that are so successful in our climate here.
What are your feelings about assisted plant migration?
That's a great question, Scott. I actually am in favor of such an activity. And particularly in the city of Seattle. You know, the city of Seattle is sort of, let's just call it a wasteland in terms of biological diversity. And so that's why at Discovery Park, I have no compunction about bringing up Calocedrus, bringing up Pinus ponderosa from Western Washington, bringing up coastal redwood, basically assisting them in their migration northward, as might happen, or is assumed to happen as climate's warm here. It gets a little touchier if you're in a truly natural area, and people are doing it, studying the effects of it, and providing guidance as to how it might be done in a way that doesn't adversely impact environments, ecosystems. And so there's a growing body of literature about assisted plant migration. So I would point you to that for details. But personally, if I was in the business of conserving plant life, I would strongly consider using assisted plant migration to accomplish my goals. And I do so in my own small way at Discovery Park. But as I mentioned, the city of Seattle is just a wasteland of native biological diversity. And so I have no compunction about throwing a few non-natives in the mix just to see what they'll do. That might be useful for future restoration work.
This next question could take a while, but we're running short on time, so keep that in mind. The
Sure.
question is, comment and question, most non-native plants are benign, only a very small percentage are invasive. And what information do you use to make choices about individual species for gardening? How do you evaluate their potential invasiveness?
Yeah, great question. I will admit that I grow certain plants that are known to be invasive. They are, however, not invasive in my garden, and so they stay around. If a plant becomes like really invasive and starts seeding itself everywhere, then it quickly leaves the garden. It's kicked out. I'm ruthless. And part of my kick butt approach to gardening. So yeah, most non-native plants are benign. Only a very small percentage are invasive. That's absolutely true. But the stuff that's coming in, particularly new stuff, or even stuff that's been here in the trade for decades, has potential to be invasive. And one of your first clues that a problem plant might be at hand is if you do a Google search on it. So the botanic name and the word invasive. So the botanic name in quotation marks, double quotation marks, and then invasive. And if you start seeing that it is identified as invasive in other parts of the world, that's your first clue that maybe something should be considered before you bring that into your garden or encourage other people to use it. So that's how I do a first cut assessment of a plant that I want to bring into my garden, I do a quick Google search to see if other places are experiencing invasive problems. There's also some models that you can use as to how a plant might be evaluated for being invasive. So for example, plants that are drought tolerant with evergreen leaves that have bird dispersed fruits frequently, not always, frequently become invasive species here in the Pacific Northwest. So if you're clamoring for a new evergreen, drought tolerant, particularly shade tolerant, bird dispersed species in your garden, you might want to do a little more thorough searching on that, because that fits the sort of the ideal model for potential invasive species here in Western Washington.
Can you name an example?
Well, let's see. An example of, well, let's say Daphne laureola. Okay, that has been in the trade for a long time. It is a shade tolerant, drought tolerant, evergreen, bird dispersed species. Ornamental, yes, but it relatively quickly around the world, once it was outside of its natural range, began to become invasive. And it is still offered in the nursery trade. It's not on any of our lists, still lawful to sell it. But in BC, in parts of Oregon, and now here in Western Washington, Daphne laureola is a very pernicious, persistent weed. At Discovery Park, it is becoming a very abundant element of the non-native flora there. And nobody's really doing much to manage it there. And so the birds just keep pooping it out, and it keeps increasing. But there's a plant that should have gone through a screening process. Someone would have seen that it's shade tolerant, drought tolerant, evergreen, and bird dispersed. Maybe not a good idea to introduce it. How does that work for you, Julie?
So Annette sends another example. Pampas grass is invasive in North California. As our area heats up, could pampas grass become problematic here too?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. And I would love to get into the details on this one. So absolutely. So pampas grass is working its way north as climates heat up. And here in the Pacific Northwest, you can see pampas grass establishing primarily along roadsides where it has not been before. And so I'm talking about Highway 104 along I-90, excuse me, I-5, just south of Seattle. It is increasing. Phragmites is another one that is increasing. It's presumed because of the warming climate here. Miscanthus, everybody loves miscanthus in their garden, but in the Midwest, it's considered to be a very bad invasive species. And once it figures out how to sexually produce in the Pacific Northwest, it is going to be gone as an invasive species. It'll be pretty much everywhere. So there's just some great examples out there of how grasses, where they're invasive in other parts of North America or the world, are becoming increasingly problematic here in the Pacific Northwest. But there's actually a lot of detail that I could go into on that story. But the answer is, yeah, there are pampas grass and many others in the queue waiting to become invasive here in the Pacific Northwest. You're muted, Julie. Julie, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. I have some family members moving about. Thank you for
Sure.
telling me I'm muted. I'm in chat, and we're looking at all your comments and lists of plants, starting with holly and ivy, Russian olive, Portugal laurel, English laurel. And I'm also going to jump up in the middle here, and people are saying thank you for pointing out human population growth. That is sort of an untouchable, isn't it?
Yep, you can't talk about it. It
Can't
is
talk
just
about
it is something we do not talk about
Right.
in the conservation of biological diversity.
And here's one.
Bob is so right about that.
Your presentation was not depressing. Bless you for truth telling, and there's hope. So you're getting a lot of positive feedback here, but I want to end on I think this is very enjoyable. Thank you, Clay. I've been thinking the same way. Gandalf said to Frodo in Lord of the Rings, do what you are able with the time you've been given.
Words to live by, absolutely.
So I think we are at our closing now. Thank you everyone for hanging in there till the end. And Clay, you went above and beyond. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Julie. And again, thank you for the opportunity. And thank you all for your attention tonight. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good night, everybody.